Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the historical foundations of literacy and how these historical foundations can impact reading and writing as we use these skills and teach them today. As we go through and we consider how history has evolved, how literacy, has evolved through our history, I want you to be thinking about the purpose of literacy at America's inception. How is it different than our purpose now? The inclusion of diverse people in reading texts at our inception as a country, and then where we've come, how far we've come today, but still how far we need to go. And then what reading methods and materials you remember as you went through school. So just kind of keep those questions in the back of your mind as we talk through a little bit of the history today. We're going to be focusing on history in America. We know that one of the first texts we used in this country was the New England Primer. And this primer was one of the only reading texts available. And at this point in our country's inception, education was reserved for the elites. And that was until about 1830. Your New England Primer had a very strong religious influence. You can see here in Adam's Fall, we send all, that's their A, focused. For B, thy life to mend, this book attend. And of course they're referring to the Bible here. Around the mid-1800s, as education becomes more accessible to a wider variety of people, you've got the McGuffey readers. And these McGuffey readers were pretty revolutionary. They were the first series of its kind. They asked comprehension questions of the readers, so teachers obviously had access to those questions as well. In the early 1900s, we progressed into synthetic phonics, and this was a very rote skill and drill approach to literacy. Students had to memorize letter names first, then the sounds that those letters made, and then finally they worked on syllable blending. And this was just a row of syllables, another row of syllables, and they would blend those together. Ah, E, O, ah, A, just all the way down. Once they had that nonsensical syllable blending down pat, then they moved into reading literature. So once they could read the code, then they moved into reading literature. And at this time, in the early 1900s, children's literature didn't exist. So the literature students had access to was adult literature. And as we progress through the course and we talk about motivation and engagement, I want you to remember that in the early 1900s, children's literature was not a thing, and kids were reading literature meant for adults. Reading in the early 1900s was mostly listening comprehension, and what I mean by that is there was usually one text that the teacher read from, and students listened and answered questions after hearing the teacher read the text. During this time, there were also some proponents of the scientific alphabet, which is pretty interesting to look at. It reminds me of hieroglyphics. There are letters that represent each sound, and so students would learn to read with that scientific alphabet, and then they had to transfer that knowledge later into learning the American alphabet, the English alphabet. So it was very complex, and it didn't stay around long. About 1920s, you'll see the rise of the Dick and Jane texts and basal readers. With the basal readers, teachers had access to guides and word lists. This was about the time that Edward Fry conducted his research in vocabulary. So the words that were included in these short stories would be put together in a list for teachers to pre-teach and focus on throughout the lesson. The characters featured in these basal readers were predominantly white, suburban, middle-class families. And this ties back to my earlier question on what kind of diverse peoples did we include in texts. In the 1920s, it was pretty much zero was our number there. Those of you in classrooms right now, take a look through your classroom library, the books you have available for your students. Do you have a wide variety of peoples included in your text that you have on your classroom shelves. This time, 1920s, you've got the whole word approach to reading. So students are, instead of segmenting letters and sounds, building up, students are really learning to read by words. So they would, these repetitive texts, oh father, see funny Dick, Dick can play. Oh mother, oh father, Jane can't play, Sally can't play. So you see the repetitive nature of these early texts, and students began memorizing words in that way. This didn't go over well, and in the 1950s, Rudolf Fleisch publishes a book entitled Why Johnny Can't Read and What You Can Do About It. And we see the pendulum swing back towards teaching phonics and the importance of phonics in the classroom. Moving right along, we have Chall, who is a Harvard researcher, and she publishes a book called Learning to Read and really advocates for balance. So she describes how important it is that we do teach our students phonics and that code emphasis approach, but also advocates for the importance of language and good teaching and engagement and appropriately leveled materials. So then we have our balance. Then we decide to swing that pendulum a little bit further, and Kenneth Goodman, his wife was Yetta Goodman, I'm sure these names sound familiar to you, published the book What's Whole in Whole Language. And this is the 70s, and we've got the overemphasis on skill and drill workbooks, leading again to that whole language movement, which really in California didn't go over well. They tried it, all of California bought in, and then when it didn't go well, that's when we moved back to not the whole language, going back to balanced literacy again. In the 80s, we have comprehension receiving increased attention. We have literature circles, which many of us still use in our classrooms today. Book clubs, these are starting to become popular in the 80s, mid to late 80s, with the literature circles and book clubs. We have process writing and writing for authentic audiences, so not just turning papers into the teacher, but instead writing for a purpose that exceeds the four walls of the classroom. We've got whole language still pretty popular in the 1980s. If you went through school at that time, you may not be a good speller, and that would be because there wasn't a big focus in the early 80s on phonics instruction. We've got child-centered, more progressive, authentic activities. There was a large focus on literature. And then we have phonics, again, placed on that back burner. And the lack, with whole language, there was a lack of assessment. Skills in phonics, instead of receiving, decreased attention, received no focus whatsoever. And some people interpreted whole language to mean that every student had to read the exact same literature, which wasn't the purpose. Skills were thought to be learned implicitly, and this didn't work for all kids. We have about 75% of our students that will pick up reading without an explicit attention to skill building with phonics. 25% of our students will never learn to read if we have no phonics instruction. So this didn't work for all children. Content area reading suffers during this time in the 80s because teachers ended up just reading to students. Maybe you teach biology, and instead of having students navigate and work through that harder, more dense text, they were reading the text to them or reading it before class and just telling students what they needed to know. So students were not getting practice reading in the content areas, which left people unprepared to enter the workforce. So we do have more of a focus on content area literacy now, which is why we've got people from all content areas having to take this class so that they can get their Read to Succeed endorsement. In 1983, A Nation at Risk was published, and this was Reagan's report. It took 18 months to collect the research and publish, and it basically said education was just tanking, and our people were not prepared to enter the workforce and be competent readers. So you'll see a renewed focus on the phonics approach at this time. In 2000, the National Reading Panel published their report, which hit very hard the 5 pillars of literacy, which was reading instruction needed to include phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle or phonics, comprehension, vocabulary, and fluency. And so for a student to have access to great quality literacy instruction, they needed those 5 components, those 5 pillars. 2001, we have No Child Left Behind. This was an update on ESEA in 65. And No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, put a large focus on holding schools responsible for the academic progress of all students. And those of you who have been teaching for 20, 30 years know that this resulted in an increased focus on testing. 2012, we had Common Core state standards make their appearance. These were English language arts and mathematics standards written by teachers and experts from across the country. They were evidence-based, and South Carolina has since opted out of the Common Core state standards, but we have written our own math and ELA standards which closely mirror the Common Core standards that had been published. In 2014, the Read to Succeed legislation was passed in South Carolina, and in order to obtain or keep a valid teaching license in the state of South Carolina, you now have to take a series of 4 specific literacy courses. 2015, we have Every Student Succeeds Act, which again was a reauthorization of ESEA in 65. Does away with the annual yearly progress, provides more access to early childhood education and funding, and had increased resources for training teachers in both literacy and STEM areas. In policy, I want you to remember that policy is definitely shaped by research, and that research is shaped by history. But policymakers do not necessarily interpret research in the same way that we as reading professionals do. So I want you to remember that as educators, as teachers, that we know our field, we know our craft, we need to gravitate more towards that balanced approach to literacy, where we include the phonemic awareness and phonics for our younger students, comprehension for everyone, vocabulary for everyone, fluency for everyone. We need to build those skills in our children all the way through school. And I think in my experience, that's what most teachers gravitate towards, is that balanced approach to literacy, where you have exactly what you need. As we conclude this very brief and quick foundations of literacy in regards to history, I want you to think about why history matters. Why do we need to know where we've been? Is it to know where we're going? Is it to change the instruction that we provide to our students today? Think through why our history matters. Keep it in the back of your mind. Think about how you teach literacy skills, whether you're a content area person or elementary, early childhood, and you're teaching the actual skills of phonemic awareness or phonics even. I hope you have a wonderful day. Email me, call with any questions or comments, and I will see you soon.